Hello. There are things in life that start like a whisper, a quiet hum beneath the surface, nothing you'd think twice about. But this whisper came from my best friend, Daniel, and by the end of that night, it had ripped through my world like a roaring thunderstorm. It was a Friday evening, the kind of night when the house feels too quiet, even with the TV humming in the background. I had just cracked open a cold beer when my phone buzzed. It was Daniel. He wasn't the type to call unless something serious was on his mind. We've been friends since college. He's the guy who always had my back, and I had his. But the moment I heard his voice, I knew this wasn't about old memories or catching up. His tone had that edge, the kind that makes you sit up and listen. "You sitting down, man?" he asked. I thought he was messing around. But then he said it. "There's talk going around about your wife, Laura." I paused, the bottle halfway to my lips. "What kind of talk?" My voice stayed calm, but inside something flickered to life. A small, dangerous spark. I heard something from someone at the church. The church? We weren't exactly the picture-perfect religious couple, but Laura had gotten involved over the last year. She'd been attending weekly services, volunteering at events, and confessing to Father Michael regularly. I didn't think much of it. I figured everyone has their way of finding peace. I had mine with beer and a good game. But now, Daniel's voice hit me like ice water on the back of my neck. They're saying she's been meeting with him privately. More than she should be. He didn't need to explain who he was. "Father Michael?" I asked, feeling the heat creep up my neck. I set the beer down slowly, like if I moved too fast, the room might explode. Daniel didn't confirm or deny it. His silence spoke enough. "I wasn't sure if I should tell you, but, man, you deserve to know. I thought maybe you've seen something." I hadn't seen anything. That was the worst part. Laura and I had been married for 8 years, and in all that time, I never had a reason to question her. Sure, we'd had our fights, the kind any couple does, about bills, her late nights helping at the church, or how we barely had time for each other anymore. But cheating? With a priest? I laughed, but it wasn't because I found any of this funny. It was the kind of laugh you let out when you're trying to hold yourself together. "Thanks for telling me," I said before hanging up. I sat there, staring at the blank TV screen, the silence in the house now suffocating. My mind raced back through the last few months. Her coming home later than usual, the text she'd quickly swipe away when I was around, the way she seemed distant. Had I missed all the signs, or was Daniel just hearing nonsense? I stood up, the anger simmering under my skin like an old engine ready to blow. I didn't wait until the next day to start digging. If there was one thing I hated, it was not knowing the truth. I wasn't going to be one of those men who finds out years later, while everyone else had already known. Laura was still at the church. I checked her calendar, something I hadn't done in a while. There it was, like a slap to the face, Friday evening confession, Father Michael. I didn't even think twice. I grabbed my keys, stormed out of the house, and drove toward the church, my mind twisting itself into knots over what I was going to say or do. The drive to the church felt longer than it should have. My knuckles gripped the steering wheel, and the glow of the streetlights smeared across the windshield as I sped through familiar roads. Memories of Laura drifted in and out of my mind. Her laugh, the way she'd brush her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, the warmth in her eyes when she used to look at me. But tonight, those memories felt distant, almost foreign, like they belonged to a version of us that no longer existed. When I pulled into the church parking lot, it was mostly empty except for a few cars scattered near the entrance. I recognized one of them immediately. Laura's blue sedan parked neatly under the dim light of the church lamp. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, the heat of my anger boiling just under the surface. What was I going to find in there? And if I found it, what would I do? I stepped out of the car and shoved my hands into my pockets, more to keep myself grounded than to warm them. The church doors were unlocked, like always, welcoming late-night confessions from wandering souls. I didn't feel like a wandering soul. I felt like a man walking toward the edge of a cliff. The inside of the church was quiet, almost too peaceful, with only the faint glow of candles flickering along the walls. My footsteps echoed across the polished floor as I moved through the empty pews, scanning the space for any sign of her. There in the corner, a light seeped out from under a door, the confessional room. My breath hitched. I wasn't sure what I'd expected when I came here, but the reality of her being inside that room hit me harder than I thought it would. I moved closer, careful not to make a sound. As I stood outside the door, the faint murmur of voices filtered through the wood. Hers soft, familiar. His low and comforting. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was enough to twist my stomach into knots. It wasn't the sound of a simple confession. It was something deeper, something that didn't belong in this place. My first instinct was to barge in, but I held myself back, pressing my ear to the door instead. Their voices dipped in and out like waves, but then a sentence hit me clear as day. Her voice, trembling slightly as she spoke. "I'm afraid of what he'll do if he finds out." My heart slammed against my ribcage. She was talking about me. The priest's voice followed, calm and collected, like he was reassuring her. "It's okay. He doesn't need to know. We'll handle this. We'll handle this." I backed away from the door, my breathing heavy. I felt like someone had just punched me in the gut, leaving me gasping for air. I didn't need to hear anything else. The whispers, the secret meetings, the way they were covering for each other. It all painted a picture I couldn't ignore. I stormed back down the aisle and pushed open the church doors, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. I needed to think. I needed to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. I got back into my car and sat there, staring at the stained glass windows glowing softly in the darkness. Was this what my marriage had become? A secret shared between my wife and a man who was supposed to be holy? I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt, but I couldn't let myself fall apart. I drove home in silence, the anger inside me burning hotter with each passing second. By the time I walked through the front door, my hands were shaking. I had come here looking for the truth, and now that I had it, the weight of it felt like it was crushing me. An hour passed. Maybe two. I lost track of time waiting for her to return. When I heard her car pull into the driveway, I stood up and moved to the window, watching her get out like she didn't have a care in the world. She adjusted her coat, glanced at her phone, and walked up the porch steps. When the door opened, she smiled at me like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just whispered her darkest secrets to someone else. "Hey," she said casually, hanging her coat on the rack. I didn't answer. Something in my silence must have tipped her off because she turned to face me, her smile fading. "What's wrong?" I stared at her, studying the face of the woman I thought I knew, the woman who had promised me forever. But right now, she felt like a stranger standing in my home. "Where were you?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "At the church," she said without missing a beat. "Why?" I stepped closer, watching for any crack in her calm exterior. "What were you doing there?" "Confessing, like always," she said with a soft laugh, but it sounded forced, like she was trying too hard to make it seem normal. For the first time, I saw it. The hesitation in her eyes, the flicker of doubt she couldn't hide. And that was all I needed to know, that tonight was just the beginning of the answers I'd be demanding. And this time, she wouldn't get away with half-truths. I stood there, locking eyes with her, letting the silence between us grow heavy. The seconds stretched long, like we were both waiting for the other to crack. But Laura had always been good at playing the part. Calm, collected, and just mysterious enough to keep you second-guessing what you thought you knew. "So, confession, huh?" I said, finally breaking the silence. "What sins are you carrying around that you need weekly absolution for?" Her expression didn't change, but her fingers twitched slightly as she brushed her hair behind her ear. "Nothing major. Just the usual, life stresses, small mistakes, that kind of thing." I leaned against the wall, folding my arms. "Must be a lot of mistakes. You've been going to that church more often than we spend time together." She exhaled, a subtle but clear sign she was trying to stay patient. "It's just a place where I can clear my mind." "Okay. You know that. Why are you acting like this?" I studied her, looking for cracks in the perfect mask she'd worn for years. Normally, I'd let her little deflections slide, chalking them up to the kind of privacy every person is entitled to. But tonight wasn't normal. Tonight, I knew what lay behind the mask. I talked to Daniel, I said, keeping my tone casual. "He heard some interesting things about you and Father Michael." Her reaction was immediate, just a small twitch at the corner of her mouth, but it was there. It was like watching someone slip on a patch of ice and recover before they hit the ground. Daniel, she scoffed. Since when is Daniel a reliable source of information? Since he's my best friend, I shot back. And unlike you, he's got no reason to lie to me. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she still didn't flinch. So, what exactly did he say that's got you acting like this? I let the words hang between us for a second, watching her try to anticipate my next move. He said people at the church have noticed things. Private meetings with Father Michael. Whispers about how close the two of you have gotten. She crossed her arms, matching my posture like this was some kind of game we were playing. Let me guess, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Now you're going to accuse me of having an affair with a priest? Do you hear how insane that sounds? It did sound insane, and maybe that's what made me so furious. This wasn't some cliché affair with a co-worker or a neighbor. She'd chosen the one man who was supposed to be off-limits to everyone. I don't care how insane it sounds, I said, my voice rising just enough to make her take a step back. I care about what's real. And right now, what's real is that you're lying to me. Her lips pressed into a thin line. I'm not lying. I laughed, but it wasn't because I believed her. It was the kind of laugh you let out when you know you're being played, but you want to see how far the other person is willing to take the act. You're not lying? You're seriously going to stand there and tell me that those private meetings are innocent? Yes, she said firmly, her eyes locked on mine. They're innocent. I don't know what kind of nonsense Daniel's been feeding you, but it's not true. I go there to confess, to talk about things I can't talk about with anyone else, and that's it. Her words should have reassured me, but they didn't. There was something too perfect about the way she said them, like she'd practiced this line for weeks, just in case it ever came up. Why didn't you tell me you've been meeting him in private? I asked, my voice softer now, but no less dangerous. Because you wouldn't understand, she said, almost whispering. You never wanted to be part of that world. You don't believe in confession or prayer, or any of it. So why would I drag you into something you don't care about? That line hit me harder than I expected. For a second, she had me questioning myself, wondering if this was just a simple misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But then I remembered her voice in that confessional room. I'm afraid of what he'll do if he finds out. I stepped closer, closing the distance between us. Tell me something, Laura. What are you so afraid I'll find out? Her face paled, but she recovered quickly, shaking her head. You're twisting my words. I was talking about something else. Nothing to do with you. I was outside the confessional tonight, I said, my voice low. I heard enough. Her breath hitched, just for a moment, but she covered it up with a bitter laugh. You're spying on me now? Do you hear yourself? I hear myself just fine, I snapped. What I'm waiting for is you to stop lying to me. She took a step back, her arms falling to her sides. You've got this whole thing built up in your head, and no matter what I say, you won't believe me. So, what's the point? The point, I said through clenched teeth, is that I want to know why. Why him? Why lie about it? What is he giving you that I can't? She stared at me, her mouth opening slightly like she was about to say something. Maybe the truth, or another lie to keep me off her trail. But instead, she turned away, running her fingers through her hair like she needed a moment to think. I didn't give her one. Is it over? I asked. Whatever it is between you and him, is it done? Her shoulders tensed, and for the first time that night, I saw something real fear. But she still wouldn't admit it. There's nothing to end, she said softly. You've got it all wrong. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to walk away from this conversation and pretend that Daniel's call never happened, that I didn't hear her whispering secrets to a priest in the middle of the night. But I couldn't unhear it, and I couldn't erase the doubt that had taken root inside me. Go to bed, I said, stepping away from her. We're not done with this, but for now, just go. She hesitated, like she wasn't sure if leaving would make things worse. But after a moment, she turned and headed upstairs, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As soon as I heard the bedroom door close, I sat down on the couch, my mind racing. She was lying. I knew that much. But the question wasn't whether she'd admit it. The question was how far she was willing to go to keep this lie alive. And I had a feeling I was only scratching the surface of what she was hiding. I sat on the couch for hours, my thoughts circling like vultures over a carcass. The house was quiet, too quiet, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards upstairs. I imagined Laura lying in bed, maybe pretending to sleep, her mind likely spinning as fast as mine. The difference was she was trying to figure out how to cover her tracks. I was trying to figure out how to expose them. Around 3 a.m., I got up and made myself a cup of coffee. Sleep wasn't an option, not when every nerve in my body was on high alert. I paced the kitchen, the bitter coffee doing little to calm me down. I replayed the night over and over in my head, dissecting every word she'd said, every flicker of hesitation in her eyes. She denied everything. Of course she did, but denial wasn't enough to erase the truth. I didn't need her confession to know something was wrong. What I needed was proof. I opened my laptop and logged into her email. She didn't know I had the password, and up until now, I'd never felt the need to invade her privacy. But desperate times called for desperate measures. As I scrolled through her inbox, my heart pounded like a drum. Most of the emails were harmless, work-related updates, newsletters, junk mail. But then I found one that made my blood run cold. It was from Father Michael, dated 2 weeks ago. Meeting time confirmed. No details, no context, just that simple, ambiguous subject line. I clicked on it, but the body of the email was empty. Just a date and time that matched one of her recent late nights at the church. I leaned back in my chair, the anger inside me growing hotter. They were careful, I'd give them that. No explicit messages, no obvious clues, but this wasn't my first time dealing with people who thought they could cover their tracks. In college, I worked security for a while, and you learn quickly that the biggest liars aren't the ones who hide everything. They're the ones who hide just enough to make you doubt yourself. I checked her sent folder next, but there was nothing suspicious there. Either she was smart enough to delete her messages, or she was using another form of communication. My gut told me it was the latter. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through our text history. There wasn't much to see. Our recent messages were short and dull, the kind of exchanges you'd expect from a couple slowly drifting apart. But then I had an idea. I opened her messages with Father Michael. Empty. Not a single message. I gritted my teeth. No one keeps an empty thread unless they're hiding something. I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the search bar. If she was using another app to communicate, I'd find it. Sure enough, buried in a folder on her phone was an app one didn't recognize. A secure messaging app designed for privacy. I knew because I'd used it once myself for work-related matters. I downloaded the app on my phone and logged in using her credentials. My heart thumped as the messages loaded. The conversation thread between her and Father Michael wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. The messages were vague, but the context was clear. They discussed meeting times, late-night conversations, and the need to be discreet. One message from him stood out. I know this is difficult, but we need to stay strong. We can't let him find out. I stared at the screen, the words blurring as my mind processed what they meant. There was no room for doubt now. They weren't just talking about God or faith. They were talking about me, about keeping their affair hidden. I slammed the laptop shut and leaned forward, my elbows resting on the kitchen table. The rage I'd been holding back was bubbling over, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't confront her yet, not until I had more. I needed something she couldn't deny, something that would force her to tell the truth. I spent the rest of the night gathering every piece of evidence I could find. Timestamps, emails, screenshots of their messages. By the time the sun rose, I had enough to back her into a corner she couldn't escape from. Laura came downstairs around 7 a.m., wearing her usual morning robe and slippers. She didn't look surprised to see me awake, but there was a stiffness in her posture, like she was bracing for another round of questions. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, her voice soft, almost concerned. I shook my head. Didn't need to. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from me at the table. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on us. I watched her closely, waiting for her to say something, anything that could be the first crack in her wall of lies. But she just sipped her coffee like it was any other morning. I decided to test her. "I was thinking about last night," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "You said you'd go to the church to confess, but it seems like you and Father Michael have a lot to talk about outside of confession." She froze for just a second, her eyes flicking to mine before she set her cup down. "We don't," she said. You're reading too much into this. I don't think I am. I slid my phone across the table, the screen displaying one of their messages. You want to explain this? Her face drained of color. She stared at the screen for a moment, her fingers trembling slightly as she pushed the phone back toward me. You've taken out of context. There is no context that makes this okay, Laura, I said, my voice rising. You've been meeting him in secret, lying to my face, and now you're trying to tell me I'm the one twisting things? I didn't do anything wrong, she insisted, her voice breaking. He's been helping me through some things, that's all. I slammed my hand on the table, making her flinch. Don't lie to me again, Laura. I've seen enough to know the truth. Her eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't moved. Not this time. I wasn't falling for the act. What's the truth, then? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Since you think you know everything. The truth, I said, leaning in, is that you've been sneaking around with a man who's supposed to be untouchable. And now you're going to tell me why. She wiped her eyes, her breathing shaky. But even now, she wouldn't admit it. I didn't cheat on you, she said, her voice firm despite the tears. You've got it wrong. But I hadn't gotten it wrong. The question wasn't whether she'd cheated, it was why. And I wasn't leaving this table until I got my answer. The tears streaming down her face weren't the kind that come from guilt. They were the kind people shed when they're cornered, when they know they're trapped but refuse to surrender. She sat there, silent and trembling, her fingers curling into fists on the table. I leaned back, trying to steady the fury clawing at me. Let's get something straight, Laura. I'm not asking you anymore. I'm telling you. I know you've been meeting him. I know it's more than confession. And you're going to explain exactly how it started. She shook her head, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. It's not what you think. It's not like that. Then tell me what it is, I said, my voice low and cold. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks pretty damn obvious. She hesitated, biting her bottom lip like she was weighing her options. I knew that hesitation. It was the same look she gave me years ago when she wrecked my car and spent 2 days pretending she hadn't. Laura wasn't a bad liar, but she wasn't great at hiding when she was cornered. I was struggling, she whispered, her gaze falling to the table. You don't understand what it's been like. I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. Instead, I let her talk. Ever since last year, when we started drifting apart, I didn't know how to fix it, she continued. I felt disconnected. From you. From everything. I thought if I went to church, I could find some kind of guidance, something to help me figure out how to save us. You wanted to save us by sneaking around with a priest? I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Her head snapped up, and for the first time, I saw a flash of anger behind the tears. I wasn't sneaking around in the beginning. I was trying to find help, and at first it worked. Father Michael listened. He didn't judge me. He told me that marriage is hard and that it's okay to feel lost sometimes. I crossed my arms, leaning back. And then what? One day, you decided he was a better option than me. It wasn't like that, she said sharply, her breath catching as she struggled to control her emotions. I didn't go looking for anything inappropriate. I just needed someone to listen. I waited, letting the silence press down on her until she squirmed in her seat. But things changed, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't supposed to happen, but we got close. Too close. And I didn't know how to stop it. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest, but I refused to let her see the pain. How close? My voice was like steel. She avoided my gaze, her fingers trembling as she traced circles on the table. We kissed once, she said, her voice breaking. Just once. And I regretted it the second it happened. I didn't believe her. Not for a second. People don't risk everything for just one kiss. But I let her keep talking, hoping she'd trip over her own lies. I pulled away, she continued, her words rushing out like she was desperate to get them over with. I told him it couldn't happen again. That's why we've been meeting in private. I was trying to fix things, to make sure he understood that it was a mistake. I slammed my fist on the table, making her jump. You expect me to believe that? After everything I've seen, you're seriously trying to convince me this was just a kiss. It was just a kiss, she yelled, her voice cracking. I didn't sleep with him. I didn't cheat on you the way you think I did. I stood up, pacing the kitchen to keep myself from exploding. You've been lying to me for months. You've been sneaking around, meeting him in secret, deleting messages. That's more than a damn kiss, Laura. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. For a moment, I considered walking out of the house, giving myself time to cool off. But then I remembered the message I'd seen. We can't let him find out. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the screenshots of their messages, shoving it in front of her. If it was just a kiss, why are you both so desperate to keep this hidden? She lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen. Because I was afraid of what you'd do. You've never been good with this kind of thing. I knew you'd jump to conclusions. I'm not jumping to anything, I said. You've handed me the truth, and I'm dealing with it. She sobbed harder, but I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. Was he the one who kissed you first? I asked. Or did you go to him? She didn't answer, which told me everything I needed to know. I sat back down across from her, my fists clenching under the table. You've got one last chance to tell me the full truth, Laura. If you lie to me again, I'll find out on my own, and it won't be pretty. Her breath hitched as she tried to compose herself. It started with me, she admitted, her voice so soft, I almost didn't hear it. I kissed him first. I was vulnerable, and he didn't push me away. I swallowed the lump of rage forming in my throat. And after that, you just kept meeting him, talking to him like nothing happened. It wasn't like that, she whispered. We talked about ending it, about setting boundaries. But every time I saw him, it was hard. I didn't want to ruin what we had at the church. I didn't want people to start asking questions. So, you protected him, I said bitterly. You lied to protect the man you kissed. And you let me go on thinking our problems were my fault? No, she cried, shaking her head. I never wanted this to happen. I was trying to protect you too. I didn't want you to know, because I didn't want to lose you. Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. But instead of crumbling, I felt the fire inside me burn even hotter. You already lost me, I said quietly. The moment you chose him over me, this marriage was done. The only question left is how you're going to fix the mess you made. Her sobs grew louder, but I stood up and walked away, leaving her at the table. I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. There were still pieces of this puzzle missing, and I wasn't stopping until I found them all. I locked myself in the spare room after that. The air inside felt stale, the walls closing in around me as I paced back and forth, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. She admitted to kissing him. She admitted to sneaking around. But something still didn't add up. A kiss might have been the spark, but there was no way this fire had been burning for months without more fuel. I thought about going back downstairs, forcing her to give me the rest of the story, but I knew better. She wasn't going to give up everything in one sitting. No, Laura was the kind of person who revealed things in pieces, hoping each piece would satisfy you enough that you wouldn't go looking for more. But I wasn't satisfied. I was only getting started. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through the screenshots again, this time focusing on the vague messages between her and Father Michael. There was something about them that nagged at me, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then it hit me, the dates. The messages weren't random. They lined up with specific events over the past few months. The night she'd come home late, the weekend she'd volunteered for church events, and the one weekend trip she'd taken to a religious retreat. I had brushed the trip off as nothing at the time. She'd said it was a spiritual weekend meant to help church volunteers reconnect with their faith. But now I wasn't so sure. I pulled up my calendar and checked the dates. Sure enough, the retreat had taken place the same weekend as one of their private messages. Looking forward to this weekend. It'll be good for both of us. My hands shook as I searched for more information about that retreat. I found the church's event page and clicked through the photos from the weekend. Most of the pictures were harmless. Groups of volunteers in prayer circles, people helping with community service projects. But then, buried near the bottom of the gallery, I found it. A picture of Laura and Father Michael standing a little too close together, their smiles a little too comfortable. I zoomed in, examining the way his hand rested on her lower back, just barely noticeable, but enough to make my blood boil. They weren't just a priest and a volunteer. They were something more. Something they thought they could hide behind the guise of faith and good intentions. I needed more proof. The kind that couldn't be explained away with vague excuses about vulnerability and mistakes. So, I went back to the messaging app and started scrolling further, searching for anything that could confirm my suspicions. And then, I found it, a message from Laura, dated just a week ago. I'm scared. What if this ruins everything? Father Michael's reply came minutes later. We'll figure it out. You're not alone. I stared at the screen, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. What were they scared of? What could possibly ruin everything? My mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had they planned to run away together? Was she planning to leave me for him? I couldn't sit still anymore. I stormed out of the room and headed downstairs, my footsteps heavy against the hardwood floor. Laura was still sitting at the kitchen table, her head buried in her hands. She looked up when she heard me, her eyes swollen and red. I need to ask you something, I said, my voice cold and unforgiving. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her robe, trying to pull herself together. What now? That retreat, I said, crossing my arms. What happened there? Her face went pale, and for the first time, she didn't try to deny anything. Nothing happened. Don't lie to me, I said sharply. I saw the picture. I saw the messages. You were with him the entire weekend. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. You don't understand. Then make me understand. I cut her off. Tell me what really happened. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table, like she was holding on for dear life. We didn't sleep together, she finally said. We just spent time talking. About us. About you. I took a step closer, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. And her gaze fell to the floor, her voice barely audible. We kissed again. But that's all. I swear that's all. I didn't believe her. Not anymore. You're lying, I said, my voice like steel. There's more, isn't there? She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was confused. I didn't know how to deal with everything. Stop making excuses, I snapped. I'm done listening to you twist this into something innocent. I want the truth, Laura. All of it. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed, but I didn't let up. What are you scared of? I asked, repeating the words from her message. What could possibly ruin everything? Her sobs grew louder, and for a moment, I thought she might collapse. But then, she lifted her head, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. I think I'm pregnant, she whispered. The words hit me like a freight train, knocking the air out of my lungs. I stumbled back, gripping the counter to steady myself. What did you just say? She covered her face with her hands, her voice muffled. I found out a few days ago. I haven't told anyone, not even him. I don't know what to do. My mind spun, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place in the worst way possible. She wasn't just scared of being caught. She was scared of the consequences, the kind that could destroy more than just our marriage. Is it mine? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Her silence was deafening. I stared at her, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Answer me, Laura. Is it mine? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know. The room spun, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. But then, the rage took over, drowning out everything else. I grabbed my keys off the counter and headed for the door, ignoring her cries for me to stop. I wasn't running away. I was preparing for war. And when I came back, I wasn't going to be the man she thought she could lie to anymore. I was going to be the man who made sure she paid for every betrayal. I drove for hours, the road stretching out endlessly in front of me. I didn't have a destination in mind, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house, not after what she'd just dropped on me. The words echoed in my head. I think I'm pregnant. I don't know if it's yours. They rattled around like bullets, tearing through whatever hope I had left of salvaging this mess. The morning sun was breaking through the horizon when I finally pulled into the parking lot of a diner on the outskirts of town. I parked in the farthest corner and sat there for a moment, staring at the cracked leather steering wheel, wondering how my life had spiraled so far out of control. One mistake, one kiss, she'd said. But now, that mistake had grown into something bigger, something alive, and it wasn't even clear if it was mine. I stepped inside the diner, the smell of stale coffee and greasy bacon wrapping around me. The place was nearly empty, Just a few truckers scattered across the booths, nursing their cups of caffeine as they prepared for long hauls. I found a seat near the window and ordered a black coffee, ignoring the curious glance from the waitress. I didn't know how long I sat there, staring into the dark liquid, but at some point, my phone buzzed on the table. I didn't want to look at it, didn't want to see her name flashing across the screen. But I knew it was her. Laura wouldn't let this go. Not after I walked out like that. Reluctantly, I picked up the phone and checked the messages. Laura, please come home. Laura, we need to talk. Laura, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I'm sorry. I tossed the phone back onto the table like it burned my hand. Sorry wasn't going to cut it this time. Not after she'd lied to me over and over. Not after she'd dragged our marriage through the mud and thrown me into a storm I hadn't signed up for. But as much as I hated her in that moment, I couldn't ignore the questions swirling in my head. Was she telling the truth about the pregnancy? Did she really not know if it was mine or his? And if it wasn't mine, what the hell was I supposed to do with that? I took a long sip of coffee, the bitterness biting at the back of my throat. My mind raced through every possibility, every scenario. I could leave her, pack up my things, and start over. It would be messy, but at least I wouldn't have to deal with the fallout. Or I could stay, force her to come clean about everything, and make sure the priest paid for what he'd done. That last thought stuck with me. Father Michael, the man who had stood at the altar and preached about loyalty, honesty, and faithfulness. The man who had whispered in my wife's ear and stolen something that wasn't his to take. I clenched my fists, my knuckles turning white. He wasn't going to walk away from this untouched. Not if I had anything to say about it. I finished my coffee, paid the bill, and walked back to my car. My mind made up. I wasn't running anymore. I was going back to that house, and I was getting the truth, whether she wanted to give it to me or not. When I pulled into the driveway, her car was still there. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint glow of the living room, lights spilling through the cracks. She was waiting for me. Good. She wouldn't have to wait long. I stepped inside, the door creaking softly behind me. The house was eerily quiet, like it was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. I found her in the living room, sitting on the couch with her knees pulled to her chest, a blanket draped over her shoulders. She looked like a wreck, her hair tangled, her eyes swollen from crying. But I didn't feel sorry for her. Not anymore. She looked up when she heard me, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak, but I held up my hand, silencing her. I'm not here to listen to more excuses, I said, my voice cold and steady. I want the truth. All of it. No more lies. She swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket, like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. I already told you everything. No, you didn't. I cut her off. You told me what you thought would keep me from walking away, but you haven't told me the whole truth. I know there's more. Her shoulders trembled as she took a shaky breath. What do you want me to say? The truth, I said, stepping closer. Tell me if the baby is his. Tell me if you've been sleeping with him behind my back this whole time. She shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face again. I haven't. I swear, I haven't slept with him. I stared at her, searching for any sign that she was lying. But for the first time since this all started, I saw something different: fear. Not the kind of fear you feel when you're caught, but the kind that comes from genuinely not knowing what's going to happen next. I don't know whose baby it is, she whispered, her voice cracking. I wish I did, but I don't. I made a mistake, and now I'm paying for it. I turned away, pacing the room as I tried to keep my emotions in check. So what? You expect me to just sit here and wait for the answer? Wait to see if the man who's supposed to be a spiritual leader is the father of your child? She sobbed harder, her hands covering her face. I don't expect anything. I know I messed up. I know I ruined everything. I stopped pacing and looked at her, the woman I had once loved, the woman who had turned my life into a nightmare. You didn't just ruin this marriage, I said. You ruined us. You ruined the trust we built, the life we had. Her cries filled the room, but I didn't flinch. I'm going to get a paternity test, I said, my voice steady. And if that test tells me the baby isn't mine, I'm done. I'll leave, and you can deal with the fallout on your own. She nodded, her sobs quieting just enough for her to whisper, I understand. I didn't respond. I grabbed my keys again and headed for the door. But before I left, I turned to face her one last time. And don't think for a second that he's getting away with this. She looked up at me, her tear-streaked face filled with dread. Please don't do anything to him. It'll only make things worse. I shook my head. You should have thought about that before you brought him into our lives. With that, I walked out the door, slamming it behind me. This wasn't over. Not until I made sure Father Michael felt every ounce of the pain he had caused me. The wind was howling when I stepped outside, but the cold didn't touch me. My blood was boiling too hot for that. I drove fast, faster than I should have, gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping me from driving off the edge. Father Michael's church wasn't far, and with each passing streetlight, I felt the storm inside me grow stronger. When I pulled into the empty parking lot, I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at the church's towering steeple. It looked different tonight, less like a place of worship and more like a monument to betrayal. I thought of how many times Laura had walked through those doors, how many lies had been whispered within those walls. I thought of the messages they had exchanged, the secrets they had shared, and the baby that might not be mine. I got out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots echoing through the night. The church was dark, but I knew he'd be there. Priests didn't have regular office hours, but Father Michael had a habit of staying late, or so Laura had told me once. Back when I thought her words were innocent. I tried the front door, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of incense and candle wax hitting me like a punch to the gut. The silence was oppressive, the kind that makes your ears ring. I moved through the empty pews, my footsteps echoing like gunshots. The light coming from the back of the church told me exactly where he was. I followed it, each step heavier than the last. When I reached the small office, I didn't bother knocking. I pushed the door open, and there he was, sitting at his desk, scribbling something into a notebook. He looked up, and for a second, the surprise on his face almost made me smile. Almost. Mr. Rivers? His voice was calm, too calm. What brings you here at this hour? I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. You know exactly why I'm here. He set his pen down slowly, folding his hands on the desk like he was preparing for a polite conversation. I'm afraid I don't. Don't play dumb, I said, my voice cold as steel. You've been meeting with my wife. You've been lying to me. And now, there's a baby involved, and we both know there's a chance it's yours. To his credit, he didn't flinch. But I saw the way his fingers tensed, the way his jaw tightened. I'm sorry to hear that things have gotten this far, he said, like he was delivering a sermon. But you're mistaken if you think. I'm not mistaken, I interrupted. I've seen the messages. I've heard her admit to the kiss. I know everything. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. If you know everything, then you also know that Laura and I made a mistake. A mistake we've both been trying to correct. A mistake. I laughed bitterly, taking a step closer. Is that what you call it? You preyed on her when she was vulnerable, and now you're trying to wash your hands of it like it's nothing. He stood up, but he didn't move toward me. Instead, he walked around the desk and leaned against it, his posture relaxed. Too relaxed. I never forced Laura to do anything. She came to me because she needed guidance, and yes, we crossed a line. But I'm not the villain you're making me out to be. Oh, you're exactly the villain, I said, my fists clenching at my sides. You're a man who's supposed to be above this, but instead, you're hiding behind that collar while you ruin people's lives. I'm not hiding, he said calmly. I've been trying to fix things, to make sure she understands that what happened between us was wrong. I laughed again, this time louder, the sound echoing through the small office. Fix things? You've done nothing but make it worse. She's pregnant, and you're telling me you don't bear any responsibility for that. He hesitated, and that hesitation was all I needed. You don't even know, do you? I pressed. You don't know if the baby is yours, and you're too much of a coward to face the possibility. I'm not a coward, he said, his voice finally losing its calm edge. I made a mistake, and I'm willing to face the consequences. But violence isn't going to solve anything. Violence? I took another step forward, closing the gap between us. I haven't laid a hand on you yet. But don't think for a second that I won't. He straightened, meeting my gaze without flinching. What do you want, Mr. Rivers? An apology? I've already given you that. Do you want me to disappear? Leave the church? Is that what this is about? No, I said, shaking my head. I don't care where you go or what you do after this. What I want is for you to admit that you ruined my marriage. I want you to admit that you crossed a line you can't uncross. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then, finally, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. I did, he said quietly. I crossed that line, and I regret it every day. But you need to understand something, Mr. Rivers. Laura wasn't happy. She came to me because she felt lost, and I became someone she could lean on. I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. I took a step back, his words hitting me harder than any punch. So, it's my fault now? No, he said quickly. But it's not just mine either. I stared at him, my mind racing. This wasn't the confession I wanted. I wanted him to grovel, to admit that he had manipulated her, that he was the sole reason for this disaster. But instead, he was trying to share the blame, to make me see that Laura had played a role too. I'll find out whose baby it is, I said finally, my voice cold and steady. And if it's yours, you'll wish you had left this town before I got back. He didn't respond, and I didn't wait for him to. I turned on my heel and walked out of the office, slamming the door behind me. The night air hit me like a slap, but it didn't cool the fire inside me. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The truth might have started to come out, but there was one final piece of this puzzle left. The baby. And once I had that answer, the real reckoning would begin. Bye.